Starting off at 109, the absolute worst card in the game is the Battle Healer because she can only be used in Elixir Golem decks. Which is why Elixir Golem is next because it's the absolute worst win condition in the game. I mean, why would it be good to use when it's basically giving your opponents free Elixir? Furnace is the worst building in the game. It doesn't have any synergy in most decks, and with all the poison and earthquake to take it out easily, it's not going to be getting a lot of value. Coming up at 106, we have the Mirror. Of course, it's going to be one of the worst cards in the game, considering you need to spend one more Elixir every time you play a card, and it doesn't pair well in any deck. Now, this next one might be surprising to you guys because a lot of mid-ladder players love the Wizard, but the Wizard is one of the worst cards in the game because for 5 Elixir, he's easily countered by a lot of cards in the game. Maybe when you first start out, he's a great option, but as you progress, unlock more cards that are better options than him, you'll realize that he's actually a quite easy card to counter and doesn't have a ton of synergy in some of the best decks in the game. At 104, we have the Clone. Sure, you can catch people off guard sometimes, and it can be good in some situations in Lava Clone, but pretty much every spell is going to be good against it, especially things like arrows, poison, and tornado. Recently, the Barbarian Hut got a rework where it spawns 3 Barbarians instead of 2. That hasn't helped the card very much though because it's still very expensive at 6 Elixir, and pretty much every spell in the game is quite valuable against it. At 102, we have the Night Witch. Night Witch is definitely one of the worst cards in the game because when you think about it, she's pretty much only played in Golem decks, but as we've had new cards released, there's so many other alternatives you can use instead of her in Golem, so now you don't even see her all the time in Golem decks anyway. Skeleton Dragons are pretty weak overall. Sure, you can play them in Lava Hound decks, but again, kind of like with the Night Witch, there's other alternatives you can use, such as Baby Dragon, Mega Minion, and Phoenix, so they're not a requirement to have in Lava anyways. The Witch, kind of like the Night Witch, isn't that good. She's a little better, but overall, you're only going to see her in Giant Graveyard decks and maybe some other off-meta decks. At the highest level, or high up on ladder, you only see her played with the Skeleton King, but that's still pretty rare. The Goblin Hut is a little better ever since it got that rework spawning 3 Spear Goblins instead of 1, but with that being said, it's still not that effective of a card in most decks, especially because it's countered so easily by Earthquake, Poison, and some other spells. At 98, we have the Skeleton Barrel. Now, it can be pretty good in Mega Knight Bait, or potentially some mortar decks occasionally, but with that being said, with the amount of people running small spells and also buildings, it can be hard to reach the tower and get a lot of damage with it. Barbarians are still viable now, but they're certainly a card that has gotten worse over time as cards have been added to the game that can easily replace them that they were primarily used in, such as Lava Hound decks. Kind of like the Skeleton Dragons, Barbarians aren't a requirement to have in Lava, and you can use other things instead, such as guards, or even the Tombstone Mighty Miner, stuff along those lines. Even though P.E.K.K.A is one of the most popular cards in the game, P.E.K.K.A is actually not that great right now because of how many ways she can easily be distracted by things like skeletons, goblins, skeleton army, and even though the P.E.K.K.A deals a lot of damage, unless the P.E.K.K.A ends up locking on the tower, it's not going to end up getting as much value as you'd expect. Ever since Rocket got that damage nerf to Crown Towers recently, it has been one of the worst spells in the game. There's so many other alternatives of better spells you can use, even lightning or medium spells, because you're no longer able to Rocket cycle that well, which is why you only see Rocket in log bait decks for the most part. Similar to the Skeleton Barrel, the Battle Ram definitely struggles to reach the tower sometimes just because of how many people are running buildings, and it's easy to stop with other support cards as well, especially things like the Electro Wizard or any kind of reset that can stun it. At number 93, we have the 3 Musketeers. Now, this is an interesting one because they're so expensive, and you could argue they're very easily countered, but when they're used in the proper deck and used at the right time with patience, so typically waiting until double or triple elixir to use them a lot, that's when they can thrive and get a lot of value. Although Sparky does deal a lot of damage every time it shoots, because it takes so long to shoot in between shots and there's so many reset cards in the game, it's fairly easy to counter, and in some matchups it gets little to no value, especially if the opponent has something like a Rocket, a Lightning, or even an Electro Wizard. Ice Golem is a card that over time has been continued to be replaced by other better alternative options. The issue for the Ice Golem is there's so many tanks in the game, so there's not much of a need to use Ice Golem, which is why you don't really see it used a lot, except in 2.6 decks or the occasional Loon Cycle. Coming in next at number 90, we have the Tesla. Obviously, the Tesla is very good inside of Expo and part of what makes Expo a pretty strong, solid deck, but in most other decks, you're way better off using another building besides the Tesla. You can use the Heal Spirit if you want, but it's definitely the worst spirit in the game. It doesn't get as much value as the others, and you're mostly only going to see it in bridge spam decks and maybe Sparky from time to time. Firecracker can be annoying to deal with, but because she's able to activate the King Tower, she's a risky card to use in certain decks, especially when you have a ground win condition, and arrows, of course, are extremely effective against her. At 87, we have Zap. It's just simply the worst small spell in the game. As more stuns and resets are in the game, there's less of a need for it, and you're mostly only going to see this card in Giant Double Prince or Lava Hound decks, and that's about it. Next is the Princess. Of course, she's incredible inside of log bait decks, but that's about it, because she's very weak to things like log, arrows, and just doesn't have a lot of health or deal a lot of damage, but if they don't have the right spells, that's when she can get a decent amount of value. Goblin Giant's gonna be number 85. He's obviously quite good inside of Sparky decks. I think he's a little better than the Sparky itself because sometimes he's seen in some spam decks outside of Sparky, but with that being said, he can be countered pretty easily by buildings, and it's a risky card to use overall since he does end up costing 6 elixir. Freeze is a card that's highly dependent on the matchup. Obviously, you are going to see Freeze get quite a lot of value inside of Lumberloon Freeze and in Graveyard Freeze, but for example, if your opponent has a poison, which is very commonly used in the meta, the Graveyard Freeze deck is going to get little to no value. When the Ice Wizard got that spawn damage buff, it has helped him a little bit, but he still doesn't deal that much damage, and nowadays you pretty much only see him in Splash Yard decks, in super defensive decks, just because he doesn't deal a lot of damage at all. The Electro Dragon can be pretty strong in some decks, such as Golem, but kind of like the Firecracker, you got to worry about the King Tower activation, and things such as lightning completely wipe it out easily. The Skeleton Army can be insane on defense if your opponent doesn't have the right spell, but if they do have a good spell, it's extremely easy to counter, and as you progress through the game, there's just some better options or alternatives you could use instead. At 80, we have the Rage. One of the worst spells in the game still, but it has gotten a little better when they added in that spawn damage. It's especially very nice to have inside of bridge spam, because if someone plays a Skeleton Army or Bats, you can completely wipe it out just by playing the Rage. Mega Minion is a card that is quite good inside of Lava Hound, Giant Double Prince, and some other beatdown decks, but kind of like some of the other support cards I was talking about before, there's a lot of other alternatives that are oftentimes better, such as the Baby Dragon or the Phoenix, so it's not needed to be used. The Inferno Tower is a pretty expensive building for it being 5 elixir, but it is going to be very good against Giants, Golems, Electro Giants, Lava Hounds, expensive win conditions. However, it's going to be a lot worse against cycle decks, so that's kind of the trade-off you are going to have to make depending on the matchup. Goblin Barrel has gotten a lot worse recently as a win condition ever since the Rocket got nerfed. That indirectly nerfed the Goblin Barrel, since Goblin Barrel's almost always played with Rocket, and the Goblin Barrel itself got a nerf because the Goblins take longer now to stab the tower, and there's so many cards like Log that can quite easily take it out. The Spear Goblins are a little better after their recent buff, but overall, not that versatile. You mostly only see them in minor wallbreaker decks, and most of the time, people consider them a fairly weak card that can be countered with ease. At 75, we have the Goblin Gang, which happens to be slightly better than the Spear Goblins, and they also got a buff too, because the Spear Goblin buff affected them as well as the Spear Goblins. But once again, they are very weak to spells, but they are definitely more threatening than the Spear Goblins are. The Minion Horde can be super valuable in certain matchups, kind of like the Skeleton Army. It deals a ton of DPS, but of course, stuff like arrows and fireball are going to take it out no problem, and in those types of matchups, it's not going to do a ton. Prince combos extremely well in decks like Giant Double Prince, and also Mega Knight Prince Wallbreakers has recently emerged and been really dominant in the meta. With that being said though, even though he's a very strong defensive card and even can break through on offense, he is quite easy to counter with things such as the Tombstone, Goblins, or other distractions like that. At 72, we have the Bowler. Even though he might not be an extremely versatile card, the decks he's used in are so good, such as Graveyard, Lumberloon, and there isn't a single spell in the game that's good against him, and just the defensive value he provides is absolutely insane in some situations. For a while, the Rascals were one of the worst cards in the game, but ever since they got that recent buff, they are back and a solid card once again, especially inside of Logbait decks. In Mortar, you're going to see them the most often. At number 70, we have Mega Knight, one of the most hated, loved, controversial cards in the game. At 7 Elixir, he is quite expensive, and there are many ways of countering him, but with that being said, there are many decks you could use the Mega Knight in. You could use Mega Knight Ramrider, you could use Mega Knight Wallbreakers, or you could even run Mega Knight Graveyard or some just straight up off-meta Mega Knight deck, which mid-ladder players do. At number 69, we have the Elite Barbarians. These cards are very annoying sometimes, especially if you're low on Elixir. They can be really frustrating to defend, but assuming you have the right cycle and Elixir, they are quite fair to stop with cycly type of cards, kind of the same situation as the P.E.K.K.A. At number 68, we have the Royal Delivery, potentially one of the most underrated cards in the game because mid-ladder players, I feel like, do not use this card very much or think it's very good, but in minor control decks, it is so strong on defense and can just really buy you a lot of time to defend really big pushes. At 67, we have the Goblin Cage, a great card on defense, allowing you to counter push after you defend with it. It's seen very commonly in Recruits Hogs, but also in Electro Giant and Golem decks. At 4 Elixir, the Electro Wizard is a fairly valuable ranged support card that is really good at stunning troops and buying you more time to defend, but at the same time, he is of course going to be very weak to certain spells. The Balloon is a reliable win condition, especially in Lava Hound decks, but on its own, quite easy to stop because all you have to do is tornado the balloon to your King Tower, or even just use a building or any kind of air attacker, and you'll be able to stop it without a major issue. At 64, we got the Lumberjack, a very fast, quick, quite an annoying card sometimes, very solid inside of Bridge Spam decks, Lumberloon Freeze, and Golem, so a fairly versatile 4 Elixir card, but you can stop it quite easily on defense, but I think the most value it holds sometimes is when it drops that Rage spell on the end to help with your counter push. Right above the Lumberjack, we have the Mini P.E.K.K.A. Does a little bit more DPS than the Lumberjack, which means it's going to be a little bit better on the defensive end, especially against tanks such as Electro Giant, Golem, Giant, anything along those lines. It's going to be able to whittle down quite quickly. The Royal Recruits might not be too versatile of a card because they are quite expensive and mostly known for just being used with Royal Hogs, but with that being said, when they are played, they can get a ton of value, especially if the opponent doesn't have something like a Log or a Valkyrie or any kind of splash card that can take care of them. Even though the Golem is quite expensive at 8 Elixir, it's actually quite a viable card. You see it quite often even at the top of ladder, and there are many different combinations with Golem that you can use and spell sequences too, so there's a large variety of Golem decks that can be played. At 60, we got the Bomber. So it's only 2 Elixir, which means it's going to be very valuable in certain situations. At the same time though, things like arrows, spells, or flying cards are just going to be great against it, so it ultimately depends on the situation and if you need splash damage in the matchup. Elixir Collector is the type of card that's very reliant on matchup. If your opponent has an Earthquake, a Fireball, a Poison, or a Miner, it's not going to get that much value. However, on the flip side, if your opponent doesn't have any sort of spell to deal damage to the Elixir Collector, or if they even have a Rocket, then it's not going to be that effective against the Collector, and it's going to be obnoxious for your opponent to deal with. It's also amazing inside of 3 Musketeers. Giant is 58. I feel like when people think about the Giant, they think of it as a pretty average card, and it's an okay win condition, especially in Giant Graveyard, and you might see some Giant Sparky, but there's a lot of buildings, fishermen, and just overall other counters to deal with him, so he mostly serves the purpose as a tank and isn't even always going to make it to the tower. One of the most popular win conditions to use in the game, the Expo, is going to be up next. Now, this is a card that, again, kind of depends on the matchup. If your opponent has a tank, you're going to have a hard time getting through. But if they don't have any sort of big spell or a good tank, and you're running some sort of cycle deck, or you're low on elixir and single, then you're going to have a really tough time defending this card. After some recent buffs, the Executioner is finally a somewhat decent card, especially when he's paired with the Tornado. He can do wonders on defense, especially against air cards and swarms, but even on offense, it can be obnoxious for your opponent to deal with if you have a Hog coming in supporting him or a Goblin Drill. For only 2 elixir, the Bats are a cheap, effective air card that is going to be very good inside of cycle decks like Miner, Wall Breakers, with the overall goal of trying to bait out small spells from your opponent or force them to overcommit. So they're a very effective tool in doing that. Coming in at 54, we got the Goblin Drill. This is a card that's not too popular at mid-ladder because there's a lot of people using things such as Wizard, but as you progress through the game, there's less people running good counters to it, and it can be hard for your opponent to stop when it's played in the right hands. The Earthquake is going to help you break through any building with ease, which is why you commonly see this card used with Hog Rider and the Royal Hogs. But on the flip side, you might get some of those matchups where if you're against an air deck, it's going to get little to no value. So kind of depends what you're up against. Royal Hogs are a pretty good win condition, and what's nice about the Royal Hogs is you can split them. So even if you're against a Mega Knight deck or a Valkyrie deck, you can play 2 in one lane, 2 in the other, to make things annoying for them and have to pick and choose which lane they end up defending. Bandit coming in at 51, she's going to be incredible inside of Bridge Spam decks, such as Ebarb's Bridge Spam or P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, and because she's very quick and dashes, sometimes can catch your opponent off guard, and you can sometimes use her as a springboard if something is close to the tower and line her up for a potential second dash. As I already mentioned with the Mega Knight earlier, Ram Rider very good inside of Mega Knight decks, but then you also see her inside of just Bridge Spam decks with the Lumberjack and the Magic Archer. Especially when she's raged up, she can be super difficult for people to stop if they don't have a building or a reset. Hunter is one of the best cards in the game against air cards such as the Lava Hound and the Balloon. It's known for being great against that. Against some other things, other ranged units, it struggles a bit against and some spells, but in certain decks like RG, definitely worth including in your deck. We got the Baby Dragon at 48. It does splash, so that means it's going to pair really nicely with the Tornado, bringing units together for it to splash all of them. That's why you're often going to see the Baby Dragon in Splash Yard, Golem, and Electro Giant. The Fisherman is one of the main reasons why RG is as good as it is. For only 3 elixir, it serves a similar purpose to the Tornado, being able to easily get King Tower activations, but also what it can do is pull units away that people are using to counter one of your win conditions, just yank it away, so then they're unable to defend. The Fire Spirit is better than the Heal Spirit, but it still is worse compared to the other spirits. It deals a high DPS, so if you do get it to connect on the tower, and since it's only 1 elixir to cycle, it still does get some pretty good value at the end of the day. In certain matchups, she won't get much value, maybe if you're against a Beatdown deck, but if you're against any sort of bait deck, or of course Graveyard, she is going to win you that matchup alone because of all the pigs you're going to get spawned that you can use inside of your counter push. At 44, we got the Wall Breakers. They're very cheap, so very safe win condition to use. They're usually paired with the Miner, and even if your opponent has a building, because they're so cheap, you can still sometimes outcycle it and get them to the tower anyway. The Dark Prince is a card that synergizes very well inside of heavier decks, especially Giant Double Prince, Golem, and Electro Giant. The splash helps it out a lot, and the fact that it has a shield can sometimes be really nice as well, so if a high damage card attacks it, it's still alive after. At 42, we got the Cannon Cart, one of the best defensive support cards in the game. What's really nice about it is spells aren't that great against it, because even when someone uses a spell on it and it breaks, it turns into a cannon, so it's still going to help you defend whatever you were defending before. Minions are certainly better than the Minion Horde because they're cheaper, which means they're less of a risk to play, and they do quite a lot of DPS, and arrows are not as good against the minions as they are the Minion Horde. You're going to commonly see minions used inside of air decks and also Giant Double Prince. The Royal Ghost is one of the best support cards in the game, commonly seen inside of Bridge Spam decks and also RG. The unique mechanic of it turning invisible also helps make it even better, and that's why I consider it to be better than the Dark Prince, because it's 1 elixir cheaper and it has that mechanic to it as well. The Giant Skeleton is a card that's commonly seen in competitive and at the top of ladder because for it being as expensive as it is, it's quite versatile and also annoying for people to play into. If you cycle anything in the back, it's almost always a good play to cycle Giant Skeleton same lane as it and get ready to defend. Because the Dark Goblin is so quick, not just running, but also shooting, it makes it obnoxious to defend sometimes, and this is why most people prefer using the Dark Goblin over the Princess, because on defense, especially because of the rapid fire, it can end up getting more value defending. At number 37, we got the Inferno Drag. So this is the MVP, especially against tanks such as Giant, Golem, and Lava Hound. But, of course, the kryptonite of it is going to be resets such as the Electro Wizard, Snowball, Zap, stuff along those lines. But for it being only 4 elixir, it definitely gets a lot of value in some matchups. Now we got the Hog Rider. If your opponent doesn't have a Tornado or a Fisherman, and let alone not a building either, it, believe me when I say, is going to be a nuisance. It's very quick, and because it's fairly cheap at 4 elixir, it's quite easy for you to outcycle your opponent as well, making it one of the better win conditions inside of the game right now. Guards are great inside of mortar decks, and also when I talked about the Barbarians before, how they're not that good because there's plenty of substitutes to them, this is exactly what I was talking about. In Lava Hound decks, people would rather play guards over the Barbarians just because they're more valuable for their elixir costs and spells aren't as good against them. Zappies will get you value against any deck that doesn't have a Fireball or a Poison for the most part. And even if your opponent has a Fireball, you can split the Zappies so they're unable to take them all out at once. Zappies are great at stalling and buying you more time, especially against things like Electro Giant and Royal Giant. Tombstone is one of the better buildings in the game because of how good on defense is, and it's fairly consistent, meaning no matter what the matchup is, you can get good value out of it. You can use it inside of Splash Yard decks, RG decks, Lava Hound decks, and some other things. Personally, I think the Snowball is pretty underrated right now because I consider it to be way better than the Zap, which I ranked a lot lower. The Snowball is so good because it pushes things back, which buys your win condition that you're using it with to get to the tower easier. A perfect example of this is if you're playing the Snowball with a Balloon deck or a Hog deck, and you're gonna see that there definitely. The Flying Machine is part of what makes Recruits, Hogs, and Lava Hounds so good. If your opponent doesn't have a Fireball or a Poison, or if you use the Flying Machine with other Fireball baity cards, they're going to have to pick and choose what they want to spell, which is what ends up making it annoying and very valuable. At 30, we got the Musketeer, slightly better than the Flying Machine because I consider her to be more versatile. She's played in a ton of different cycle decks like Hog, Mortar, Loon Cycle. She could even be played in Giant Graveyards, stuff that's more expensive, and she doesn't die to the Fireball like the Flying Machine does, which is a bonus. Lava Hound is going to be the next win condition. I certainly consider it to be a lot higher than the Balloon because unlike the Balloon, there aren't as many direct counters to it, such as a building or tornado, because even when a building is used against the Lava Hound, you're going to have the Lava Pups after, which you can use something like a Miner or another tank like the Skeleton King to make sure that there's still a threat that your opponent has to deal with. The Valkyrie is a very good card considering she is a tank that deals splash damage, but there are some other options and other tanks that you can use inside of the game, which means she's not necessarily a required card to be played, but in some decks, and especially mid-ladder, she is definitely incredible. Fireball's coming in at 27, which might be a bit of a shocker because for the longest time, we had it ranked higher. But with the meta shifting and the Poison getting buffed not too long ago, we've had a bit of change in the rankings of where the Fireball is at, and you guys will see soon for the others. The Magic Archer is just insane, especially in bridge spam decks, but you can also use him in minor wall breakers, and with the Tornado, you can play him in drill decks too, and it just serves as a secondary win condition. So if you can't break through with your main win condition, whether it's spam or the drill, whatever he's being played in, you can always play him at the bridge, line him up with the unit and the tower, and get pretty much guaranteed damage a lot of the time. Certainly a better win condition than the Golem, and one of the strongest win conditions in the game now, but I don't consider him broken because in some matchups he's not going to get a lot of value if you're up against a zappy deck, or even certain buildings like the Bomb Tower, Tesla, and the Mortar are going to be great against him as well, so it ultimately just depends on what the opponent has as response. Next, we got the Bomb Tower. It's considered to be one of the best buildings right now for a few different reasons. For instance, it has a lot more health than the Tombstone does, so it's a bit sturdier, more resistant to spells. Also, the splash damage is really nice that it has, and the Death Bomb. It's very commonly seen inside of minor Wallbreaker decks right now, and also Hog. There's a lot of people running Lightning right now because most of the defensive units being played die to the Lightning, as well as many of the buildings. It's also very well synergized with the Electro Giant, the Golem, and the RG, which are all pretty popular win conditions right now. And of course, it's an immediate direct counter to one of the champions in the game, the Archer Queen. The second best spirit in the game is the Electro Spirit. So even though you can activate the King Tower off of it, it is still amazing on defense and even offense just due to the ability to chain multiple things at once, which is why you're seeing it a lot inside of Expo decks and Royal Giant decks. Ever since the Knight got that small hit points buff, he ended up being a little better than the Valkyrie now. He just ends up getting slightly more value for his stats since he's a 3 elixir card, and he just serves a similar purpose to the Valkyrie in a lot of decks, but with being 1 elixir cheaper, it just makes your rotation that much faster in the long run. Cannon is one of the best buildings in the game because it's cheap at only 3 elixir, and because it shoots pretty quickly. It's not only used as a distraction like most of the other buildings, you can actually use it as a fairly high DPS defensive building as well, and it's actually an option for countering Graveyard. This now brings us to number 19, our first champion that we're going over on the list. The Golden Knight, don't get me wrong, is still super broken, and because of the fact that it's a champion in the 3-card cycle, it's always going to be good, but because the dash range was decreased a little bit, it's harder to get him to dash on the tower, especially if you aren't playing him with the Tornado. Royal Giant is one of the strongest win conditions in the game and has been for the last couple years. The other thing about Royal Giant is most of the cards inside of Royal Giant decks happen to be cards that are very strong or borderline broken in the game too, which enhances how strong he is and his effectiveness in the meta. Barbarian Barrel is one of the best small spells in the game. It's only 2 elixir, and the nice thing about the Barbarian Barrel is it serves 2 different roles. You can use it on offense to pressure because the barb will hit the tower, but it's also great on defense as a distraction, and it deals damage from the barrel. And then you also have the Barbarian helping whittle down the unit as well. So it serves many roles for the card that it is. Not too long ago, archers were one of the most broken cards in the game, but they were recently nerfed and toned down a little bit, but they are still very strong, especially inside of Expo decks, also Mega Knight Wall Breakers, and inside of Hog. So you see them in a few different types of decks, and the decks they're used in insanely valuable because even if your opponent has arrows, you can split them, so they're still going to get some solid value. At number 15, arrows are one of the best spells in the game right now. They are great against swarms, super versatile. You can play them in a lot of heavier decks and also inside of cycly type of decks, and they're very low risk card because they have such a large radius, especially as the game progresses in double and triple elixir. No matter where you play them, they're going to get value, whether it's just chipping the tower or hitting a ton of units, you name it. For the last few years, Graveyard has been one of the best win conditions in the game. Even after they removed 1 skeleton, it still gets an absurd amount of damage, especially if your opponent doesn't have the proper response to it. And even if they have good counters to it in their deck, they can get outcycled or get unlucky because of the RNG aspect of the Graveyard. At number 13, we have the Archer Queen. Without a doubt, she's one of the very best cards in the game. She did move down a little bit, though, recently after her recent first attack nerf, but with that being said, with the 3-card cycle and just with how versatile she is, very solid card, but Lightning going to be a direct counter to her. Believe it or not, skeletons are number 12. That is right, they're no longer at the very top of the list because we have goblins now that there's 4 of them. They have replaced them in majority of decks. With that being said though, skeletons are still insane and played a lot, they're just not as good as they used to be because of the goblins taking over. The reason why Fireball isn't as good anymore is because of poison. Kind of like how goblins are replacing skeletons, it's the same thing for poison replacing Fireball. Ever since they added that slow effect again to slow down units that are inside of the poison, it has proven to be incredibly valuable in so many different decks and situations. At number 10, we got the Skeleton King. It has a bunch of features that help him out so much. The fact that he deals splash damage, has a lot of health, and spawns basically a graveyard can make him so hard to deal with if you don't have the proper responses. If you don't have something like a Valkyrie in your deck, or a sort of small spell like a log, you're going to be in a lot of trouble in many different kinds of situations. After Monk got that small buff, and after the Golden Knight got that pretty big nerf that indirectly buffed the Monk as well, he is now once again one of the best champions inside of the game. You see him very commonly played inside of RG decks, and right now you can just play him in a variety of different decks, and it's just really, really annoying for your opponent. If they have any sort of ranged attacker, it's just going to get completely annihilated, and you have to be so cautious about how you use your spells against him because they're either going to get completely wasted or thrown right back at your tower. At number 8, we got the Tornado. No surprise that it's one of the best cards in the game. So many uses you can use this card for. You can, of course, activate the King Tower. You can pull things away from your win conditions, but the reason why it's better than the Fisherman is you can play it anywhere on the map. It doesn't matter where the Tornado is. Unlike the Fisherman, it has to be in a certain spot. Tornado can be played anywhere, even on your opponent's side of the map, so you can pull things together inside of your Electro Giant, for instance. The Mortar is the best building in the game right now. The reason why the Mortar is so good is because not only is it very good on defense, it's incredible on offense, so you can use it to defend, and then it gets a counter push to attacking and pressuring the tower. Now, you might be thinking, well, doesn't Expo do that? It does, but the difference is the Mortar is only for Elixir, so it is more versatile and it's easier to be played in certain decks than the Expo is. That's 6 Elixir and is way more expensive and clunkier. Even after the giant minor nerf, it deals a lot less damage to Crown Towers. It is still one of the best cards in the game. That is how versatile this card is. You can use it in minor cycle decks with spells, you can use it in minor wall breakers, you can use it in Lava Hound, you can use it in Giant Double Prince. There's just an endless amount of things you can use this card in, and it's only 3 Elixir, so very low risk, and the fact that you can play it anywhere on the map is also what makes it very good as well. At number 5, we have the Mighty Miner. I guess it's not a big surprise that it's better than the Miner, especially after the recent Miner nerf, and the Mighty Miner is a champion. I mean, it has so much health, it stays on the board for so long, and even if your opponent plays something like an Electro Wizard to counter it, you can just send it in the other lane, and then they still have to deal with it, and then if you have no Elixir left, if it locks on your tower's gone in just a few seconds. At number 4, we got the Phoenix, and are you kidding me? This card has been nerfed so many times since it came out, and they still can't seem to get it right. Still one of the most broken cards in the game. For only 4 Elixir, because it's a flying card and has as much health as it does, and the fact that it respawns, it's just such a massive threat to deal with, and because it's extremely versatile, meaning you can play it in air decks, but also many ground decks and even cycle decks, you can play it in just about any deck in the game, which is part of what makes it as strong as it is right now. The best spirit in this game is by far the Ice Spirit. This thing stalls and slows down troops for such a long time. Part of what makes it incredible is when you're defending win conditions and you pair this Ice Spirit with another unit or a building, it's just stopped right in its tracks for such a long time, so you have tons of time to fire away at it, whittle it down, and by the time it gets unfrozen, it's either dead or it's lost a lot of its health. At number 2, we have the Goblins. As I already spoiled earlier with the Skeletons, how I was saying the Goblins are better than them, I think most people know that. Ever since they added 4 Goblins, they have just been insane, the DPS, and if you want to, you can do a 2-2 split, 2 in one lane, 2 in the other, and all the decks that Skeletons were good in, Goblins are now in them instead, because even if your opponent has a log or a bar barrel, because they deal so much damage as quick as they do, they're going to get value before the log even comes down, and that's why they're as amazing as they are right now. And at number 1 on the list, we have the log. Now, this might be surprising because log has gotten so many nerfs during its time in the game, but it has proven to be an incredibly versatile card still after all of that. In pretty much every cycle deck, you're often going to see the log played in it, and even in non-cycle decks such as Royal Giant, the log is great in. The knockback is part of what makes it so good, and it's just very good against cards that don't have a lot of health. It's going to be good for the tower chip, and there's just overall so many uses for the log. Let me know what you guys think of this list. Let me know below what cards in order you guys would change. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you guys aren't subscribed already.